Part 1. A Shadow at the Threshold. The first words were a whisper through the profound darkness, a desperate plea before his eyes could even discern her face. "Take me away before dawn, or they will kill me." Kaelen Stone froze, his calloused hand arrested mid-air, inches from the well-worn rifle propped against the rough-hewn wall. A woman stood framed in his doorway, a jagged gash weeping crimson above her eye, her breath tearing raggedly in the frigid night air. She was an apparition, a stark impossibility in this desolate stretch of the Whisperwind Peaks. No one ever trespassed upon his solitude. The nearest cluster of homes, the hamlet of Oakhaven, lay a 2-hour gallop by horse, and he had deliberately carved out this remote existence precisely because he craved the absence of human interference. Yet, here she stood. Her skin bore the sun-kissed hue of the wilderness people. Her eyes, dark and ancient, pierced him with an intensity he hadn't encountered in years, a searing blend of desperation and defiant will. She wasn't pleading. She was stating a grim, undeniable truth. But it wasn't her sudden, violent appearance that truly unsettled him, nor the glistening blood marring her face. It was the way her gaze darted past him, toward the single window, as though she could already perceive the shadows closing in, hear the chilling whisper of dawn, a guillotine blade poised to fall. Kaelen had retreated to these mountains 3 years prior, a desolate exile after the fever claimed his wife and infant daughter. With his own hands, he had painstakingly constructed this cabin, anchoring it firmly beyond the grasping reach of civilization. Here, amidst the whispering pines and craggy peaks, he could tend his meager herd without the haunting echoes of voices, without the torment of faces that cruelly mirrored the unbearable chasm of his loss. The folk of Oakhaven, down in the valley, tacitly acknowledged his isolation, understanding the crushing weight of grief. They had respected his unspoken plea, leaving him to his quiet anguish, until tonight. The woman swayed precariously, her strength failing, her hand finding purchase against the doorframe. Her garments, once sturdy, now hung in tattered strips. Dried blood marred her sleeve, a map of her ordeal, and her feet were crudely swathed in strips of cloth, remnants of a shirt, testament to a long, brutal flight. She had been running, hard and relentlessly, for what must have felt like an eternity. "You need to leave," Kaelen rasped, his voice raw and unused, a sound like gravel shifting. "I want no trouble here." "Trouble is already here," she countered, stepping across his threshold without a hint of invitation. Her eyes, sharp and practiced, swept across his humble cabin, the trained awareness of one accustomed to constant peril. "They're hunting me. 5 men, perhaps 6. They believe I stole cattle from the Blackwood estate." Her gaze, unwavering, locked onto his. "I did not." Kaelen's jaw tightened at the name. Silas Blackwood, the man who had, through sheer force of will and an iron fist, forged the valley settlement into his own personal domain, dictating the very essence of law and justice. If Blackwood truly sought her death, she possessed, at best, mere hours, perhaps even less. "Then tell them the truth," Kaelen offered, though the words felt hollow and weightless even as they left his lips. "I tried." She moved with a desperate urgency to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains toward the tree line. "Blackwood cares nothing for truth. His cattle are missing. He simply requires a scapegoat, an outsider, a woman, alone, from my people." She turned back to him, her voice laced with chilling resignation. "I am convenient." Something in her tone resonated deeply within Kaelen, forcing him to pause. It wasn't fear, not precisely. It was a potent, righteous anger, the kind that seethes from being unjustly accused, from witnessing people embrace convenient lies over inconvenient truths. He had known that particular fury himself, a long, long time ago. "Why come here?" he demanded, his voice softer now. Why not flee deeper into the Whisperwind Peaks? Because they have hounds, she answered, turning from the window, her gaze sweeping his face, and horses and guns. And I have been running for 2 days, without sustenance or rest. I will not survive until dawn on my own. She paused, and for the first time, a tremor of vulnerability softened her voice. You are my last chance. Kaelen stared at her, his mind grappling with choices, each path ending in ruin. To aid her meant facing Blackwood's wrath himself. To turn her away meant her certain death before the sun graced the horizon. To do nothing at all, that was its own suffocating form of oblivion. What is your name? He finally asked, the question escaping like a released breath. Elara. She straightened, a fragile defiance fighting the crushing exhaustion that clung to her. And there is something you must know before you decide. She took a step closer, close enough that he could distinguish the fierce determination warring with the raw fear in her dark eyes. The man who actually stole the cattle. I know who he is. And Silas Blackwood would incinerate this entire valley before admitting the truth about him. In the distance, so faint that Kaelen almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind, came the unmistakable baying of hounds. Elara heard it too. Her hand instinctively moved to the small knife sheathed at her belt, and Kaelen saw the faint tremor in her fingers not from terror, but from a simmering fury at the encroaching doom. They are closer than I anticipated, she whispered, her gaze now fixed on him, urgent and pleading. So, you must decide. Right now. She looked at him, and in her eyes, Kaelen saw something that chilled him to the core, something more terrifying than Blackwood's wrath or the impossible choice laid before him. He saw his daughter's face, etched in the final moments before the fever claimed her, that same desperate, fragile hope, that perhaps, against all odds, someone might yet alter the inevitable. Who truly took the cattle? Kaelen heard himself ask, his voice strained. Elara's expression shifted, not to relief, but to something darker, heavier. Blackwood's own stepson, she stated quietly, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. Finian Blackwood, and Silas knows it. That is precisely why I will not survive until dawn. Kaelen made his decision in the infinitesimal space between one heartbeat and the next, not because he implicitly believed her, not because he harbored a sudden desire for heroism, but because the alternative meant listening to the hounds tear apart a woman upon his own property while he stood idly by. That was a sound, a memory, that would surely follow him into whatever eternal darkness awaited after death. The loft, he commanded, his gaze sweeping to the rickety ladder, leaning against the far wall. Get up there. Stay quiet. Elara did not argue. She moved with surprising agility despite her wounds, scaling the ladder quickly, vanishing into the deep shadows of the elevated space. Part 2. The Return of the Hunters. Kaelen moved to the window, his gaze piercing the obsidian veil of the Whisperwind Peaks. In the distance, like furious, agitated fireflies, 4, perhaps 5, torches bobbed and weaved through the pre-dawn darkness. They were coming, and they were closer than he had ever imagined. Minutes. That was all the time they had left. He checked his rifle, the cool metal a familiar weight in his hands, then placed it back against the rough-hewn wall. A gunfight, a desperate hail of bullets, would solve nothing. It would only paint a target on his back, adding his name to Silas Blackwood's grim ledger of those who needed killing. The dogs reached his property first. 3 of them, lean and vicious, a chorus of guttural barks tearing through the stillness. They circled the cabin, claws scrabbling at the door, their feral cries a chilling prelude. Then came the horses, their hooves thudding a slow, deliberate rhythm against the frozen earth, followed by the men themselves. Silas Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, a torch held high, his face a granite mask of righteous fury. Behind him rode 4 others. Kaelen recognized 2. Nolan Cassidy, Blackwood's foreman, a man whose loyalty was as unshakable as the mountains themselves, and Finian Blackwood, the young stepson, barely 20, who worked the Blackwood estate and followed Silas like a loyal hound. Kaelen stepped outside before they could even pound on his door. The frigid night air bit at his exposed skin, but his voice remained steady, calm. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood looked down at him, his gaze laced with barely concealed contempt. You seen an Alara woman come through here? I've seen nothing but my own property for 3 years. Kaelen replied, his voice even. You know that. The dogs say different. Blackwood gestured, and one of the men released the animals. They surged forward, a snarling tide of teeth and fur, barking and clawing at Kaelen's door. They tracked her right to your cabin. Kaelen held his ground, his shoulders squared. Then your dogs are wrong, or they're following old scent. The wilderness people pass through these mountains often, doesn't mean they stop at every door. This one's different. Nolan Cassidy spoke up, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. This one's a thief. Stole 6 head of cattle, good breeding stock. That's a serious accusation, Kaelen said carefully, his voice betraying nothing. You have proof. Don't need proof. Blackwood's voice went cold, cutting through the night like a blade. We found her near the missing cattle. She ran. That's all the proof I need. Kaelen met his gaze, unflinching. Since when is running proof of guilt, Blackwood? Maybe she ran because 5 armed men were chasing her. A dangerous silence descended, thick and suffocating. Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, and Kaelen saw something flicker across the older man's face. Not anger, not precisely. Something far worse, calculation. You protecting her, Stone? Blackwood asked quietly, his voice a low, venomous hiss. I'm protecting common sense, Kaelen replied, his voice firm. You want to hang someone, Blackwood? You better be damn sure they're guilty. Otherwise, you're just a murderer. Finian Blackwood shifted uncomfortably on his horse, his face pale in the torchlight. His eyes darted between Silas and Kaelen caught a glimpse of something troubling in the young man's expression. Fear, mixed with a potent, festering guilt. He filed that observation away. A chilling detail for later. Search the cabin, Silas Blackwood ordered, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. 2 men dismounted, their boots crunching on the frozen ground as they moved toward Kaelen's doorway. Kaelen didn't stop them. He couldn't. He simply stood in the biting cold, listening as they ransacked his home, the sanctuary he had painstakingly built with his own hands. Furniture scraped, dishes shattered against the floor, the sounds of destruction a harsh symphony in the night. They were thorough, leaving no corner unexamined. Above them, in the dark confines of the loft, Alara waited. Kaelen forced himself not to look up, not to betray her position with a single glance, a single flicker of his eyes. The search lasted a torturous 10 minutes. When the men emerged, they shook their heads, their faces grim. Nothing, one reported, his voice flat. No sign of her. Silas Blackwood's jaw tight. He stared at Kaelen for a long, agonizing moment, then at the cabin, then back to Kaelen. Maybe she kept running, Nolan suggested, attempting to break the tension. Could be miles from here by now. No. Blackwood's voice was flat, certain, a chilling pronouncement. She's close. I can feel it. He turned his horse in a slow, deliberate circle, studying the impenetrable darkness beyond the torchlight. We'll make camp a mile from here. Come dawn, we spread out and search every canyon, every cave, every shadow in these mountains. His gaze, cold and unforgiving, settled back on Kaelen. And if I find out you lied to me, Stone, I'll burn this cabin to ash with you inside it. They rode off, the thudding of hooves gradually fading into the pre-dawn stillness, taking their torches and their barking dogs with them. Kaelen waited until the last faint echo had vanished before he moved. He climbed the rickety ladder to the loft, the wood groaning softly under his weight. There, pressed against the far wall, Elara waited, her knife still clutched in her hand, her whole body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. "They're camping nearby," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "You heard?" she asked, her voice hushed, strained. She nodded slowly, lowering the knife, her fingers still trembling. "Thank you for not, don't thank me yet." Kaelen cut her off, his gaze sharp. "That young one, Finian Blackwood, he looked guilty as sin when they mentioned the cattle. He's the one, isn't he, Blackwood's son?" Elara's expression confirmed it, a silent, grim affirmation before she spoke. "His stepson," she corrected, her voice barely audible. "But Silas raised him like his own, loves him more than anything in this world." Her voice dropped further, a chilling pronouncement. "Which is why he'll kill anyone who threatens to expose him, even if it means murdering an innocent woman like me." Outside, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving darkness, a dog howled, its mournful cry, a stark reminder of their dwindling time. Dawn was 4 hours away. Kaelen climbed down from the loft, his mind already churning, grappling with options that all ended in blood. Elara followed, moving with the careful, practiced silence of someone who had learned that noise meant death. In the dim lamplight of the cabin, Kaelen got his first clear, unobstructed look at her. She was younger than he had initially thought, mid-20s at most. The jagged wound above her eye had stopped bleeding, but dried crimson matted her dark hair. Her hands were scraped raw, fingernails broken, testament to a desperate, brutal flight over unforgiving rock faces. She had fought hard to stay alive. "You need to eat," he said, moving to the small cupboard that held his meager supplies. "And we need a plan." "The plan is simple," Elara said, sinking onto his crude wooden chair at the table, exhaustion finally showing in the slump of her shoulders. "You've done enough. When they leave at dawn to search the mountains, I run in the opposite direction. Maybe I make it, maybe I don't, but you stay here. Stay safe." Kaelen set a loaf of stale bread and some dried meat in front of her. "They'll catch you before noon, probably." She tore into the food with a desperate animal hunger. "Between bites," she added, her voice muffled. "But that's not your problem." "It became my problem the moment you walked through that door," Kaelen countered, sitting across from her, studying her face. "How do you know it was Finian who stole the cattle?" Elara swallowed, washing down a mouthful of food, then met his eyes. "Because I saw him. 3 nights ago, I was traveling north toward the mining camps, looking for work. I made camp near the Blackwood property. Middle of the night, I heard cattle moving. Saw a young man driving 6 head through a canyon." She paused, her eyes distant, reliving the memory. "He was clumsy, nervous, not a practiced thief. I stayed hidden. Watched him take them toward the Badlands, where rustlers operate." "Why didn't you report it?" Kaelen demanded, his jaw tight. Elara's laugh was bitter, hollow. "To who? The Oakhaven sheriff, who thinks all wilderness people are thieves? Silas Blackwood, who owns half the territory." She shook her head, a gesture of weary resignation. "I did what smart people do. I kept my mouth shut and kept moving. But someone must have seen me near the property. Next morning, Blackwood and his men came looking. Said I stole his cattle. When I denied it, they called me a liar. When I tried to explain, they pulled guns." Her hand unconsciously moved to the wound on her head, a silent acknowledgement of the violence she had escaped. "I barely got away." Kaelen absorbed this, his jaw tightening further. "Finian didn't just steal cattle. He framed you for it. On purpose or by luck, I don't know, but the result is the same." Elara looked toward the window, toward the darkness where Blackwood and his men waited. Silas Blackwood built his reputation on being fair and just. If word spreads that his stepson is a cattle thief, his reputation crumbles. Everything he's built in this valley falls apart. Understanding clicked into place, cold and sharp. "So you have to die," Kaelen said quietly, the words a grim realization. "Not because you stole anything, but because you know the truth, and now I know it too." Elara's eyes held his, unwavering. "Which means you're in danger as well. If Blackwood suspects you, believe me, if he thinks you'll speak against Finian, he'll find a way to silence you." Kaelen stood, pacing to the window. Outside, he could see the faint, lingering glow of the distant campfire. 5 men, probably armed with rifles and pistols, willing to commit murder to protect a lie. Against them, he had 1 rifle, limited ammunition, and a woman who could barely stand from exhaustion. The odds were impossible. "There's something I don't understand," Kaelen said, still staring out at the unforgiving night. "Why would Finian steal cattle from his own stepfather? Blackwood is wealthy. The boy has everything he needs." Elara finished the last of the food, then stood beside him, close enough that he could smell pine sap and wood smoke on her torn clothing, close enough that he noticed the way she held herself despite her injuries, with a dignity that refused to break. "Maybe that's the problem," she said softly. "Maybe having everything given to you makes you want to take something yourself, to prove you can." Kaelen thought of his own daughter, the way she'd sometimes defy him just to feel independent, just to prove she existed separate from his shadow. The memory was sharp enough to draw blood from his heart. "You lost someone," Elara observed, reading something in his haunted expression. "Wife and daughter. Fever took them 3 years ago." The words came easier than he expected, a testament to the weight of the moment. "I built this cabin because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand their pity, or their attempts to help, or their cruel reminder that life goes on even when yours has ended. And now here I am," Elara said, a wry, self-deprecating humor in her voice, "dragging my disaster right into your sanctuary." "Yes," Kaelen agreed, then added, his gaze meeting hers, "and I'm still glad you came." Their eyes met, and something profound passed between them. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. 2 people who had been running from different things, who had found themselves caught in the same impossible moment, bound by a terrible, shared truth. Outside, one of the dogs barked, then another, then all 3, their voices rising into a sudden, frantic chorus of alarm. Kaelen's blood went cold. "They're not staying at the camp," he said, his voice flat with dawning horror. "Something's wrong." He grabbed his rifle, moving quickly back to the window. Through the darkness, he could see torches moving. Not away from his cabin, toward it. Fast. "They're coming back," Elara whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. "But why?" "They already searched." She stopped, understanding, and horror crossing her face in the same instant. "The dogs found my trail. The one I left getting here. They're following it from the other direction." Kaelen watched the torches grow closer, watched the men spread out, surrounding his cabin. This time, there would be no polite questioning, no careful search. This time, Silas Blackwood knew exactly what he'd find, and he was coming to finish what he'd started. The torches formed a menacing circle of fire around the cabin. Kaelen counted 5 points of light, which meant they had spread out to cover every possible escape route. Smart, thorough, deadly. "Get back in the loft," Kaelen said, his voice low and urgent. "No." Elara's hand gripped her knife, her eyes blazing with defiant fury. "I won't hide while you." "This isn't about hiding," he cut her off, his gaze meeting hers, a fierce intensity in his eyes. "It's about making them work for it." making them prove what they're really willing to do. She understood. If they dragged her out of the loft, if they had to search and find her, there were witnesses. Witnesses meant questions. Questions meant doubt, and doubt was the only weapon they had left. She climbed the ladder as the first fist pounded on the door. Stone. Blackwood's voice carried the weight of certainty and rage, a chilling promise of violence. Open up now. Kaelen took his time crossing the cabin. Let them wait. Let them wonder if he was preparing for a fight. When he finally opened the door, he found Silas Blackwood standing on his porch with a rifle pointed at his chest. The other 4 men had positioned themselves strategically around the cabin, weapons drawn, their faces grim and expectant in the flickering torchlight. Part 3. The Unthinkable Confession. You lied to me, Blackwood said, each word precise, controlled, an icicle piercing the cold night. I told you I hadn't seen anyone, Kaelen replied, his voice calm, unflinching. That was true when I said it. Don't play word games, Stone. Blackwood stepped forward, forcing Kaelen back into the cabin's meager light. The dogs tracked her scent right to your door, then circled around back. She came here. She's here now. Behind Blackwood, Nolan Cassidy and the other men filed inside. Finian Blackwood lingered in the doorway, his young face pale in the flickering torchlight, his hands trembling slightly. Guilt or fear? Kaelen couldn't be sure, but it was a potent, volatile mix. Search it again, Blackwood ordered, his voice laced with renewed fury. Every corner, every shadow. They tore through the cabin with a savage, unrestrained violence. Blankets ripped from the bed, floorboards pried up with the blunt ends of rifles. The small root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, Kaelen's meager storage, was exposed and ransacked. They were hunting now, not merely investigating. The distinction mattered, profoundly. Kaelen stood motionless amidst the escalating chaos, watching them systematically destroy 3 years of solitary peace in a matter of minutes. His rifle remained against the wall, deliberately out of reach. Starting a gunfight, a futile hail of bullets, would solve nothing. It would only give Blackwood the excuse he craved to kill them both and claim self-defense, a convenient narrative for Oakhaven. Nothing down here, Nolan reported, emerging from the root cellar, his breath misting in the cold air. Blackwood's eyes, like a predator's, moved upward, toward the dark, elevated space of the loft. Up there, he commanded. 2 men moved toward the rickety ladder, their boots crunching on the splintered wood Kaelen had laid with his own hands. Kaelen's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the silent chamber of his chest. But he kept his face expressionless, a mask of stone. This was the moment. Either they found Ilara or they didn't. Either way, blood would follow. Wait. The voice came from the doorway, thin and strained. Finian Blackwood stepped into the cabin, his young face drawn, contorted by some profound internal struggle. Maybe we should what? Blackwood turned on him, and Kaelen saw the flash of something truly dangerous in the older man's eyes. Go home? Let a thief escape? You want to explain to the other ranchers why we let someone who steals our livelihood just walk away? I just mean, Finian's voice cracked, raw with emotion. Maybe there's been a mistake. Maybe she didn't. There's no mistake. Blackwood cut him off with a terrible, chilling finality. Now either help or get out of my way. Finian fell silent, but not before Kaelen caught the look on his face. The young man knew that the woman they were hunting was innocent, knew that he, Finian, was the real thief. And the crushing weight of that knowledge was slowly, relentlessly destroying him. The 2 men reached the loft, their boots scraping on the wood above. Kaelen heard them moving through the dense darkness. Seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. Then a voice, rough with surprise, called down. Found something. Kaelen's breath stopped, caught in his throat. Blackwood moved to the base of the ladder, triumph already etched across his granite face. But when the man descended, he wasn't dragging Alara. He held a torn piece of cloth, stained unmistakably with blood. "This is fresh," the man reported, holding it up for Blackwood to see. "She was here recently." Blackwood examined the fabric, his gaze fixing on Kaelen with cold, predatory calculation. "Where is she?" he demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The blood is still wet." Blackwood held up the cloth, a crimson accusation. "She was in that loft within the last hour. Which means you've been hiding her, which makes you an accomplice." The cabin fell silent, save for the crackle of the torches outside. Kaelen knew the law in these territories, a brutal, unforgiving code. Harboring a known thief carried the same penalty as theft itself. In remote places like the Whisperwind Peaks, where justice was delivered by men like Silas Blackwood, that penalty was death. "Last chance, Stone." Blackwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, a venomous hiss. "Tell me where she went, and maybe I forget you helped her. Stay silent, and you hang beside her." Kaelen looked at the faces surrounding him. Nolan Cassidy, loyal to Blackwood above all else. The other two ranch hands, grimly following orders, and Finian Blackwood, standing in the doorway, trapped, agonizingly, between truth and loyalty. "You know what I think," Kaelen said slowly, his voice clear and steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I think you're terrified." Blackwood's face darkened, a storm gathering behind his eyes. "Careful. I think you're so scared of the truth coming out that you're willing to murder an innocent woman." Kaelen took a defiant step forward, closer to Blackwood, closer to the truth. "And I think you know damn well who really stole those cattle." The rifle butt hit him before he even saw it coming. Pain exploded across his jaw, a white-hot agony, and Kaelen tasted blood, thick and metallic. He hit the floor hard, his vision swimming, stars exploding behind his eyes. When he looked up, Blackwood stood over him, weapon raised for another strike, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Search the property," Blackwood ordered the others, his voice ragged with suppressed rage. "The woods, the shed, anywhere she could hide. And if she's not here," he looked down at Kaelen, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as winter ice, "then we'll persuade Mr. Stone to tell us where she ran." In the doorway, Finian Blackwood turned away, unable to watch, his body racked with silent tremors. And in that moment, as blood dripped from his split lip, Kaelen knew exactly what he had to do. The unthinkable was no longer a choice. It was the only option left. Kaelen pushed himself up from the floor, the pain radiating through his jaw. Through the cabin window, he could see the men with torches spreading out to search his property. They'd find the shed, the small corral where he kept his 2 horses, the woodpile, every hiding place within 100 yards, and eventually, relentlessly, they'd expand their search. They'd find Alara, wherever she ran, unless he gave them something else to focus on. Something bigger than a fleeing wilderness woman. He gave them himself. "You want to know who took your cattle?" Kaelen said, his voice steady despite the pain, cutting through the silence of the ransacked cabin. "I did." The cabin went silent. Blackwood stared at him, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. "What?" "I stole your cattle." Kaelen met his eyes without flinching. 6 head. Drove them into the Badlands 3 nights ago. Sold them to rustlers for $60. Blackwood's rifle lowered slightly, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "You're lying. Trying to protect her." "I'm telling the truth." Kaelen turned to Nolan Cassidy. "You said they found her near the missing cattle. That's because she saw me. She was camped in that canyon, witnessed me driving them through. That's why you've been hunting her. Not because she stole anything, but because she's a witness to what I did." The logic was sound enough to plant a seed of doubt, to make the lie believable. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, studying Kaelen's face for any telltale sign of deception. Why would you steal Kaelen Stone? You have your own herd. Had. Kaelen kept his voice flat, convincing. Lost most of them to disease last winter. Been barely surviving since. When I saw your cattle wandering near my property line, I took my chance. He paused, adding detail. A crafted truth, to fortify the lie. I knew you'd blame wilderness people. Everyone always does. Figured I was safe. From somewhere outside, hidden in the impenetrable darkness, Kaelen heard a sharp intake of breath. Elara. She'd somehow climbed out of the loft, escaped through a gap in the roof boards. She was listening, and she understood exactly what he was doing. No. Her voice cut through the night, raw with desperation and fury. He's lying. I'm the one you want. I'm right here. She stepped into the torchlight, knife raised, her face fierce, despite the exhaustion and injuries. Take me. Leave him alone. Blackwood swung his rifle toward her, but Kaelen moved faster. He put himself between the weapon and Elara, his back to her, shielding her with his own body. She's confused, Kaelen said quickly, his voice urgent. Thinks she's protecting me, but I already told you the truth. I stole your cattle. She's just a witness who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's protecting me. Elara's voice rose with desperation, unwilling to let him sacrifice himself. I saw Finian. Enough. Kaelen turned, and the look he gave her was sharp enough to cut, a desperate plea hidden in the fury. In his eyes, she read a clear message. Trust me. Let this happen. Be silent. Her words died in her throat. She looked from Kaelen to Blackwood to Finian, who stood frozen in the doorway, guilt written across every feature of his young face. Understanding crashed over her like a cold, inescapable wave. If she spoke the truth about Finian, they'd both die. If Kaelen took the blame, at least she'd live. You have a choice, Blackwood, Kaelen said, his voice firm, still watching Elara, ensuring her silence. You can waste time trying to chase down a woman through these mountains, risk losing her in the darkness, and maybe never get your justice. Or you can take the man standing right in front of you, the one who actually committed the crime. Blackwood considered this. Kaelen could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. A confession from a white rancher was worth 10 times more than catching a wilderness woman. It would satisfy the other settlers, prove that justice was blind, make him look fair and reasonable. Where's the money? Blackwood demanded, the suspicion in his eyes slowly giving way to conviction. Buried behind the shed. Tin box. I can show you. Blackwood gestured to Nolan Cassidy. Check it. While Nolan went to search, Blackwood kept his rifle trained on Kaelen. You realize what you're confessing to? What the penalty is? I know. Kaelen's voice was calm, accepting. But I'm tired of running from what I've done. Tired of letting innocent people suffer for my choices. He glanced at Elara one last time, a profound message in his eyes. She deserves better than being hunted for my crimes. Nolan returned, carrying a small, weathered tin box. He opened it, revealing $58 in mixed bills and coins. Kaelen's entire savings. The meager life he'd scraped together over 3 years of isolation and hard work. Found it exactly where he said, Nolan reported, his voice flat with grudging respect. Blackwood stared at the money, then at Kaelen. The evidence was damning. Too specific to be a lie. Too convenient to be anything but the truth. Except it wasn't truth, it was sacrifice. Tie him up, Blackwood ordered. 2 men moved forward with rope. Kaelen didn't resist as they bound his wrists tightly behind his back, the coarse rope cutting into his skin. He kept his eyes on Elara, watching her face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally, a terrible, heartbroken understanding. No, she whispered, tears glistening in the torchlight. Don't do this. Tell them. There's nothing to tell. Kaelen's voice was gentle, final. Go home, wherever that is. Live your life. That's all I ask. Blackwood grabbed Kaelen's arm, pulling him toward the door. As they dragged him outside, Kaelen took one last look at his cabin. 3 years of peace, gone in a single night. But as he looked at Alara, standing in his doorway with tears streaming down her face, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his daughter died. Purpose. Blackwood shoved him forward, toward the horses, toward whatever waited at dawn. Behind them, Finian Blackwood watched in silence, the weight of an innocent man's sacrifice crushing down on his guilty shoulders. And in the cabin doorway, Alara made a decision of her own. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. And she wouldn't let Kaelen Stone die for a crime he didn't commit. Part 4. The Hour of Reckoning. The false dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised gray as they dragged Kaelen to Oakhaven. His wrists, raw and bleeding from the ropes, throbbed with every step. His jaw, where Blackwood's rifle butt had struck him, pulsed with a dull, persistent ache. Yet, he kept his head high, his gaze steady, his expression a mask of calm resolve. Behind him, riding at a distance, came Alara. She had taken one of his horses, a sturdy bay, without asking, and no one had stopped her. Why would they? She was free, innocent, the victim of a crime, not its perpetrator. But freedom, Kaelen knew, felt like chains when she watched him stumble over the rough, frozen ground, his hands bound, his future now measured in mere hours. Oakhaven was a small cluster of perhaps 40 buildings, huddled protectively around a central square. In the heart of that square stood a massive ancient oak tree. Kaelen knew that tree, had seen it used for hangings before. That was where they would put the rope around his neck when the time came. Silas Blackwood's voice, booming and resonant, cut through the early morning stillness as they entered the square. Gather around. I've got the cattle thief. Windows creaked open. Doors groaned on rusty hinges. People emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the irresistible promise of justice or vengeance. In these untamed territories, Kaelen had long observed, the two were often indistinguishable. Within minutes, a crowd had formed, 30 people, perhaps 40, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. Kaelen recognized some. The stoic blacksmith who had once forged his horseshoes, the bustling woman who ran the general store, a few ranchers from neighboring properties. All of them stared at him with a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and chilling satisfaction. Silas Blackwood dismounted and strode to the steps of the settlement hall, positioning himself above the growing crowd like a judge, delivering a final, unappealable verdict. He raised his hands for silence, his powerful voice carrying easily across the square. This man, he announced, his finger pointing directly at Kaelen, confessed to stealing 6 head of my prized breeding cattle. He drove them into the Badlands and sold them to rustlers. We found the money buried on his property, and we found the wilderness woman he brazenly tried to blame for his own crime. Blackwood paused for dramatic effect, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, a master of his grim stage. The penalty for cattle theft in this territory is death by hanging. Does anyone object? Silence. Thick and suffocating, it pressed down on the square. Not because people agreed, Kaelen knew, but because no one dared to stand against Silas Blackwood. He scanned the edges of the crowd, his eyes finding Alara. She remained mounted on his horse, her face a stark canvas of conflicting emotions, raw rage, desperate calculation, and a profound, aching sorrow. Their eyes met across the square, and Kaelen shook his head ever so slightly. Asterisk. Don't. Asterisk. The message was clear, a desperate plea for her to stay silent, to do nothing. Asterisk. Whatever you're planning, don't. Asterisk. She looked away, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "The hanging will take place at noon," Blackwood continued, his voice ringing with cold authority. "This gives everyone time to witness justice being served. To see that in this settlement, we don't tolerate thieves, regardless of who they are." Noon. 6 hours. That was all the life Kaelen Stone had left. They locked him in a small, windowless storage shed behind the settlement hall. The door was heavy, solid oak, a single guard posted outside. The space smelled of old flour, dusty leather, and the lingering scent of despair. Kaelen sat on the dirt floor, his back against the rough wooden wall, and tried not to think about the rope, about the ancient oak, about the terrifying moment when the ground would disappear beneath his feet. Instead, he forced his mind to conjure images of his daughter, the infectious peal of her laughter, when he lifted her onto his shoulders, the way her tiny hands clutched his hair. He thought of his wife, who had once told him that the true measure of a man wasn't in what he took from the world, but in what he was willing to give up. He had given up everything now for a woman he barely knew, a woman he had met just hours ago, a woman whose name he had only just learned. And somehow, in the chilling silence of that shed, it felt profoundly, terribly right. Outside, he heard voices, arguments, a low, persistent hum of debate. The settlement was arguing about his fate, even though Blackwood had already sealed it. Some thought hanging was too harsh for cattle theft. Others, fueled by fear and self-preservation, demanded it be carried out immediately. A few, a brave few, questioned the confession itself. "Stone never seemed like a thief," he heard a voice say, muffled by the thick wood. "Kept to himself, worked hard." Another, sharper voice countered, "That's exactly what makes him dangerous. The quiet ones. You never see them coming." Time passed, slow and merciless. Kaelen had no way to measure it, save for the changing angle of light that seeped under the crack beneath the door. Morning crawled into mid-morning. The oppressive heat built within the enclosed space, and sweat ran down his back. Then, with a soft creak that startled him, the door opened. Elara slipped inside quickly, closing it behind her with practiced silence. The guard outside said nothing. She must have bribed him, Kaelen thought. Or perhaps convinced him with a truth he couldn't refuse. "I'm getting you out," she whispered urgently, her voice strained, her eyes blazing with fierce determination in the dim light. "No." Kaelen's voice was firm, surprisingly steady. "This is done. You're safe. That's what matters." Safe. Anger flashed across her face, hot and furious. "You think I can be safe knowing you died for something you didn't do? Knowing I ran away while an innocent man hanged?" She knelt in front of him, her torn garments rustling softly. "I won't let that happen." "You don't have a choice," Kaelen countered, his gaze unwavering. "There's always a choice." Her eyes burned with an unyielding resolve. "Finian Blackwood is out there right now, looking like death itself. The guilt is eating him alive. I saw him vomiting behind the general store. Saw the way he can't meet anyone's eyes." She gripped Kaelen's shoulders, her fingers digging into his shirt. "He wants to confess. I can see it in every movement he makes. He's just terrified of what his stepfather will do." "Blackwood will never let him," Kaelen stated, the grim truth a heavy weight between them. "Then I'll make him confess in front of so many witnesses that Blackwood can't stop it." Elara stood, her stance defiant. "I didn't ask you to die for me, and I won't accept that sacrifice." "Elara," Kaelen began, trying to reason with her, to make her see the futility. "My mother once told me that debts of blood can only be paid in action." She cut him off, her voice low and resonant, echoing in the confined space. She moved toward the door, her hand already reaching for the latch. "You gave me my life. Now I'm going to give you yours." She slipped out before Kaelen could stop her, the heavy door closing with a soft thud, plunging him back into darkness. He was left alone, but not with despair. Instead, a terrible certainty began to grow in his chest. Whatever Elara was planning, it would either save them both, or condemn her to hang beside him. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop her. Part 5. The Unraveling. Elara found Silas Blackwood behind the livery stable, sitting on a water trough, his head in his hands. He looked younger than his 20 years, fragile, as though a strong wind might break him apart. She approached slowly, her hand deliberately away from the knife at her belt. He wasn't her enemy, not really. Just a coward who had made a terrible choice and now lacked the courage to unmake it. "You can't sleep," she said, her voice a quiet statement, not a question. Finian's head snapped up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face ashen. "Leave me alone." "Can't eat either," Elara continued, her voice soft but steady. "I saw you try at the general store. Saw you run outside to be sick." She sat on the trough beside him, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to speak quietly. "The guilt is destroying you. You don't know anything about me." "I know you stole 6 cattle 3 nights ago," Elara countered, her voice level, factual. "I know you drove them through the canyon toward the Badlands. I know you saw me watching from my camp, and decided to let your stepfather believe I was the thief." She paused, letting the bitter truth hang in the pre-dawn air. "And I know that right now an innocent man is going to hang for your crime." Finian stood abruptly, his hands shaking. "He confessed. He said he did it. We both know that's a lie." Elara stood too, facing him, her gaze unwavering. "He's protecting me. And by staying silent, you're murdering him." "I didn't ask him to confess." Finian's voice broke, raw with misery. "I didn't want any of this." "Then stop it," Elara commanded, taking a step closer. "Tell the truth right now before it's too late." "I can't." The words came out as barely a whisper, a choked sound of utter despair. "My stepfather, if he finds out what I did, everything he's built, his reputation, his standing in this territory, it'll all collapse. He'll never